Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Inaya Folarin Iman, a journalist, political commentator, and social campaigner. She is the founder and director of the Equiano Project, a forum to promote freedom of speech and open dialogue, and the founder of the Free Speech Champions Project, which aims to inspire free speech and open inquiry amongst young people. Inaya, welcome to Savage Minds. I'm really happy to speak with you because I've been a big fan of your writing. I discovered your writing reading Spiked, where I also publish. I really loved every piece I've read of yours. It's just been wonderful and refreshing given the past year's events.
Thank you.
It's just amazing work. What really is thrilling is in this era of, it's in a way metaphorical, the lockdown, because we've been prior to the virus living in sort of mental lockdown culture between call-outs and getting speakers canceled and trying to get people fired from their jobs, etc. It's been a very strange time for those of us who have social critiques that I don't think are conservative, but nonetheless, if you speak against lockdown culture, you're branded as a conservative. People will say, well, no, there's no such thing as cancel culture.
Yeah, I think, that's been one of the kind of striking things is the kind of acceleration of the way in which people are caricatured. And I think part of that it is to do with also just the lockdown in and of itself, is that we don't experience people in a kind of multi-dimensional way. There isn't a kind of public square or a field to which we can kind of engage with each other on a human to human level. Or all we see is kind of fragments and very kind of curated and particular fragments, whether that on social media. So it becomes very easy to not engage with people from an intellectual level, but to kind of just put them in a box. And I think that's very unfortunate. And yeah, it's also this whole kind of the way in which anyone that doesn't accept wholesale a bunch of premises that have come to kind of shape the public conversation, whether that is on the lockdown, whether that is on kind of globalization or gender or race, is automatically kind of framed as on the right. And I just see it as a kind of example of how shallow public discourse has become.
Truly. And also there's this aporia. It's incredible to me. It reminds me of that Sufi tale of the man who tries to take, is it a bird out of the jar, and he can't because he has the bird in his hand and he has to make a choice between his hand and the bird. And I think about this often since lockdown, especially in the ways in which we have all this access to knowledge. You know, it could be the Middle Ages and we can't even go out because there's a far worse thing called the plague. And people starved to death at this point in time in history because there was great fear about dying because of having contact with this Black Death. Well, now we've got something that's far less insidious. And at the same time, we have this wealth of information, the internet. Never before have I seen so many lies afloat than this past year, where people just grab onto the latest Twitter storm and they create their own facts, despite having at their fingertips a wealth of information. You know, I struggle to understand how we have so much and we make so little use of it as a society, I mean. And how when we try to make sense of that, to paraphrase someone the other day, they read something or maybe they listened to something I said and they said, well, in another world, you know, you would be considered a right-wing conservative American. And I'm thinking, oh, well, okay, I'm American, but since when does talking about the left's ignoring class politics or historical materialism or their focus on race as a real something Darwin had made fun of? I mean, people forget that Darwin made fun of this. And here we are 150 plus years later, and people are clinging to the very tropes of racism in a quote unquote positive way. I find this alarming.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. I think there's always been a kind of struggle with what to do with race. You know, some people have kind of seen the kind of revolutionary potential of race, and other people have seen it as a kind of inconvenient reality that we just kind of have to accept and negotiate our way within. And then other people have kind of um, asked for the complete abolishing of race. And I think now um, it's quite interesting because arguably the left's position is more conservative. This idea that we should kind of accept the reality of race and negotiate our way within it. Whereas, you know, individuals like myself and many others call for something quite radical, which is the kind of total and complete transcendence of race. And to me, that's a much more transformational and radical and revolutionary possibility that is a possibility that I also do believe can be realized, that than a position that just accepts race and not just accepts it, actually seeks to kind of institutionalize it. And I think that's a very, very sad place that we're in, that is somehow framed as a progressive position.
Well, that's one of the articles I read about yours when you make reference to Camille Foster's and Thomas Chatterton Williams' attempt to shift the conversation about race. They're stating, and even lately I saw Thomas Chatterton Williams said that he wants to abandon the idea of blackness even. This was on Twitter about 2 or 3 days ago. And you wrote, leftist identitarians are fond of talking of human attributes as social constructs. However, their use of social constructionist ideas is less radical than it sounds. In terms of race, they suggest that merely inverting racial hierarchies is sufficient to achieve social justice. So instead of whiteness being constructed to connote purity, power, and intelligence, modern activists seek to invert its meaning so that it connotes guilt, debasement, and privilege. And likewise, you say, with blackness, activists seek to imbue it with new meanings from innocence to moral superiority. I love that piece. Now,
Thank you.
I have to say, like, I read it and I was like head nodding the whole time. And, you know, I followed Thomas Chatterton Williams on Twitter and I did the same. Now, the thing here is, and as you know from the Harper's letter as well, people are sort of up in arms over the notion that we should maybe be focusing on race. And I've had this discussion with people because I've followed the gender wars for now 9 years. It's exhausting. And that same group of folks, they tend to be the same group. They believe that we have an internal race, we have an internal gender, and all of these concepts, when you start to, scratch the surface, it's a very prototype of Christianity, albeit non-religious, but everyone has a soul. It's a gendered soul, it's a racial soul. And I tell people, I'm like, wait, that's a bit racist, no? Or that's a bit regressive sexist, like 1950s. How do we shift the conversation when we have a whole body of leftists and they're totally in the woke posture still? I'm hoping that dies down, but they really believe it's onward Christian soldiers. Like, if you do not buy into the goodness of, well, we saw it during COVID. I don't know if you saw what happened to Adolf Reed as well, but he tried to slap down the idea of there being some kind of proven relationship between biological determinism and COVID sickness rather than sociological determinism. And people took issue with that and disinvited him from the DSA convention in Philadelphia, New York. And I'm thinking, wait, this is a person who we need on the left. And he's saying that this kind of rhetoric is unhelpful. In fact, it could even be seen as racist. So we're back trying to explain to people who think that they're the answer to racism, that they might be part of the problem. How do we approach these people? Like, how do we discuss it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And I think, what you said about Christianity, I think is a really important one, because one of the quite striking things about the last few years has been actually the way in which religious ideas have essentially been kind of rehabilitated and repackaged in a new way. without the kind of possibility of actual salvation that you might get if you were a kind of religious believer. So we see that in the kind of the rituals that have just catapulted into the kind of forefront of global consciousness, whether that's kind of taking the knee, apologizing, all of these kinds of things have just, these kind of almost religious like rituals have kind of filled the gap, and also the way in which people repent for their guilt. And if only you kind of do the work or read certain books or listen to certain podcasts, will you then be educated enough to be able to perhaps repent for your kind of awful sin of racism? And it is quite striking, the kind of parallels in the kind of fervor and the kind of dogmatism that we've actually seen in a lot of the kind of more left authoritarian ideology. But yes, you're very right as well about the kind of the almost essentialist, the kind of rehabilitation of essentialist ideas, again, to be framed as progressive. So whether that's kind of female or male stereotypes, or as you said, kind of race as something that should be reified and institutionalized, and kind of whiteness as a very distinct and separate and specific concept, as in opposition to kind of blackness as a particular set of characteristics that Black people can never escape from or transcend. And it's a real kind of, it's incredibly regressive, and there's no vision for the future. There's no idea of where we're trying to go as a society. There's no realm to which we actually go, what are we collectively trying to achieve? Okay, we might have different ways of doing it, but are we really trying, are we both genuinely trying to work towards the goal of abolishing racism and race? And that part of the conversation hasn't seemed to be there. But in terms of how we shift the conversation, one of the things that I've been really thinking about more recently, and this is partly why I've kind of taken a slight step back from the conversation, is thinking that whilst all of these things have come up, whether that is, questions about changing names or kind of critical race theory or unconscious bias, all this kind of stuff, it seems to be a kind of feedback loop. And instead of kind of me thinking about why my ideological opponents, let's just say, are wrong, and I kind of know why I think they're wrong, I'm really thinking about recently, what is it in what they're saying that's actually true? Because when I think about that, then I kind of see how that kernel of truth has been kind of a kind of grander, bigger narrative has been able to kind of make sense of that very small truth. And so when I kind of focus upon what is it that what they're saying is true, then I can perhaps reframe the narrative around that particular truth. And some of the things that they are saying that are true. So there is a sense, we're not fully sure what it is, but there is a sense, whether that's Trump supporters or Black Lives Matter supporters, many different types of people, that there's something wrong. That I don't know if that's a perennial sense that we always think that that's something wrong in society, so we can, try and innovate. But there is this sense that whether that's the political system, the way of socially organizing, economic inequality, there's something that feels unfair, and they're kind of picking up on that sense. The second truth in what they're saying is obviously that there is racism still exists. I'm not sure it's anything that can ever be abolished, but they kind of play into that historical legacy and kind of instrumentalize it for various broader political goals. And I think when I start to think about the truth in what they're saying, then I think I can try and actually respond to that very real deep sense of grievance, but perhaps find an alternative path. So I think attacking it and criticizing it is definitely important in terms of exposing it for its weaknesses. But a lot of people don't believe things because they're factual. There's a lot of things we believe that we don't have any evidence for. We just believe them. And so I'm really interested right now, and as I said, thinking about how this narrative has come to become so compelling.
Well, it's interesting to me because in thinking about our discussion today, I was writing down some ideas. I wrote a piece on Darwin last year, and I spoke to Adam Rutherford about this as well, because I'm very interested to see what scientists are making of this kind of Darwinian mythology, because he was very clear. There is no race amongst humans. Okay. Now, we also know that racism in its historical reality, the word race as the root of that word has come into play. So people will say racism in the same sentence that they say race. Okay. So instead of saying race, people might mean to say skin color or ethnicity, etc. Fair enough. And I take these shorthands for what they're worth. But then I get to, well, I'll use my own life. My father is Indian. My mother is Canadian. And I grew up hearing people saying, oh, so you're mixed race, or you're mixed, or you're colored. So in the 1970s, it was very common for people just to bring that up. And I was a little kid watching people, even seeing people discuss with my parents or whatnot. I almost felt like I was a breed of dog. You know how people will talk about dogs saying, he's half terrier and half this. And as I grew older and I would think about what I witnessed, I felt it touched me. And I still am touched by this. I was thinking of this yesterday. I was in the US Army and I was in airborne school. After my first jump from the airplane, you're trained to jump, you hit the ground and everything, and you start to collect your parachute. As I was collecting my parachute, one of the men who for the previous weeks had been yelling at me, he was a black hat, basically a drill sergeant, but you say black hat in airborne school. He came up to me. He was in his 30s. Most of my black hats were, in fact, African American. And he said to me, he said, congratulations, because I was no longer, I was a new airborne person. And he said, one question, are you black? And I looked at him and I said, no. I was a bit shocked simply because he had never spoken to me in any way that wasn't to jump to the ground and give push-ups or run faster or, I was given commands for these weeks before.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking about this. So my identity has always been a curiosity for people, even though in real life, I don't run around subtitling myself. My friends know about me and my life because we have talks just like your friends you, and then they meet your friends and your family and your sister. And, people learn about people in very natural ways. We don't run around with subtitles. So I was thinking about all this and the way in which whiteness is constructed. Because I tell you this story because at the age of 10, I moved from very white Canada, even though, again, my father is from West India. We moved straight to the South, New Orleans. And that cultural shock, and it was a cultural shock, was wow, revealing of so many things. And I suddenly found myself in a culture where that one drop identity was on full swing. If I would see, many African Americans with who were in fact albino, white skin and white afros, but there was a nomenclature all in place. If you had one parent who was black and one parent who was not, as in my case, you were black. And if you had one grandparent, and so forth and so on, the one drop rule still existed in the 1970s in New Orleans. And I'm thinking, why is it that whiteness is ultimately what's at stake here? It's being protected, when in fact, I think whiteness is a myth. This is my theory. Because when you look back in history, Inaya, there's so many examples from the way history framed Russian and Polish identity. 150 years ago, these were not considered white identities at all. They were considered Oriental. Like, I'm using the words of the Orientalists, by the way. And the same thing goes for the mestizo identity. Octavio Paz writes of this in The Labyrinth of Solitude. He writes a beautiful portion of that book is dedicated to the chingada. It's this expression in Mexican Spanish where people will be like, hijo de la chingada. And chingada means a friction, a hitting, a violation. And he says that the Mexican race, the mestizo, is a product of this kind of hybridity and this violence. And he goes, it's a book on this. It's well worth the read. And I keep thinking about the way in which whiteness is always dissolved in so many societies, like in Latin America, even in Morocco. The Berbers, who are lighter skinned than the Arabs, are the more oppressed group, right? So how is it that in the West, whiteness becomes, historically, it was very protected, today, as you aptly noted in your article last year, it is that reversal whereby now whiteness is guilt, debasement, and privilege, right? And we're unable to talk about the reality of, let's say, socioeconomic concerns, class, access to power, because everything's wrapped up in this pseudo religious guilt. It's original sin on the one hand for whites, and it's this kind of it's a new parody of racism in a sense as well, because BLM was also hosted by myriad light-skinned people who spoke of their own guilt, but they were at the mic, right?
Yeah, no, it's always very interesting hearing how the kind of conversation plays out internationally, because I guess, from where I am in the UK, it's a lot more, the whole idea of whiteness as it's kind of conceived in the kind of academic way, it is something that's been very much imported from the kind of critical race discourse and kind of whiteness studies in America. And it's really interesting seeing how kind of a lot of white people don't kind of adopt that identity, kind of self identify with the kind of narrative around whiteness, and see it quite foreign, because they've frequently kind of identified themselves as kind of English or kind of like British, and seeing how the kind of hyper racialized discourse is kind of playing out in a country like Britain, who never had kind of institutionalized kind of racial segregation, and the kind of way in which the kind of taxonomy of race it was exported very much to the colonies, but it wasn't necessarily in the same way playing out. So it's been very interesting seeing how that whole conversation has been, and that's very much the kind of the goal of the activists, as I write in that article, to kind of invert that meaning, because they are right in the sense that it historically was used to kind of subjugate. And so after kind of essentially feeling disillusioned with the progress of the civil rights movement, the kind of emergence of the kind of idea that to invert it is a better solution than to kind of accept the kind of status quo, even though myself and others would actually argue that we've actually come a hugely long way if we compare it to where we were at as a society only a few decades ago. And whiteness has always been, it's very interesting seeing whiteness become again a much reified concept, because again, if you look at the UK, Irish people were not regarded as white up until very, very recently. And the conception of whiteness was a very, very specific kind of Anglo Saxon kind of landowning idea. And actually, working class white people in Britain were actually often racialized as something other than white. And so, yeah, seeing activists now encompass whiteness in such a broad way, and seek to divide people in a hierarchy based off of their kind of proximity to whiteness, and mean that hierarchy must denote so many things about themselves, is a very sad thing. And so much is being challenged and broken down by that very idea, because as I've said in other interviews, according to this hierarchy, you're never a full human being. Every conversation must be stipulated by I as a X person, I as a this person, your meaning and your authenticity and your ability to fully participate in society becomes your race becomes relevant to that. And that is, to me, a challenge to so many kind of fundamental liberal ideas.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
No, absolutely. Also, I remember, when I found your name, it's a very beautiful name. And I thought, oh, I think she might be Nigerian. I'm very good at reading names and figuring out from where people, emerge on this planet, or their parents or their parents' parents. And then I read a bit further, and in fact, well, your parents are Nigerian.
yeah.
And I thought about this a lot because, people, again, when I was living in New Orleans, and people would say, "So you're Indian?" And they would ask me if I was Navajo. And so I was like, not quite. But that's the thing. Is that it? Is it the conversation stop at India, blackness, or Nigerian? Because I was much, when I have friends who are Nigerian, I'm curious to know if they're Yoruba or Igbo or other, and to know more about, well, I would love to know how to make fufu. And so I'm thinking, how is it that our discourse has stopped at, again, blackness or Asianness or whatnotness, but instead of, well, how do you make an empanada? Because in all my research in Argentina, one of the things I had to actively seek out as a vegetarian was non-meat food. So you sort of figure out how to negotiate cultures, even in terms of basic needs. Now, what is driving the left's need to re-excavate really artifices of hundreds of years ago at times, their need to see us as racial subjects? On the one hand, there's this Christianity at heart. On the other hand, I'm thinking, why is there still a need to locate the subject as a victim, as a racialized subject always? Will there ever be a time that we can just have a discussion that becomes about, again, our families, our experiences, our favorite foods, our least favorite foods, you see?
Yeah, no, I think there are a lot of different kind of sociological and economic and political reasons why we're in this particular scenario. I mean, one of the kind of perhaps societal reasons is, as some people have kind of pointed to, I think Kenan Malik's book In the Meaning of Race, he kind of talks about how, after the kind of end of the Cold War and the kind of collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the left essentially became disillusioned with the kind of possibility of kind of realizing a better society, and began to kind of retreat into much more kind of parochial forms of politics, and kind of identity is one of them, and that has been also as a result of the kind of collapse of class politics. A lot of the ways in which, at least in the UK, working class people organised ended up collapsing as a result of the change in the labour market. So whilst, at least in the UK, as I said, a lot of communities organised around industry and unions, when a lot of, as a result of deindustrialisation, a lot of people kind of moved into the kind of service sector, and a lot of those kind of jobs where people would gain democratic and political power no longer provided them with that opportunity. And so kind of race essentially became a tool for the left to kind of gain legitimacy through kind of claims of kind of racism and sexism, and this kind of move towards the kind of post material into the much more kind of identitarian and kind of parochial. And I don't think it's just a problem of the left. I think that conservatives as well have kind of only very recently started to figure out what their kind of ideological and philosophical basis has been, and that's partly been as a result of the culture wars, given them a reason to start thinking about what it is about society worth conserving. And so I think both of the ideological kind of underpinnings of our society have kind of lost their kind of philosophical orientation. And I think there's also something broader than the left that's actually happening. I think that I think there is a kind of changing view of the subject. I think that increasingly, not just from a left perspective, we are viewed as kind of not courageous and heroic and human beings that endure. We're viewed as kind of fragile, vulnerable. That there's a kind of therapeutic conception of human beings that are never fully actualized adults. Adulthood is a kind of something to fear. We look to children and the young to kind of tell us how to live in our society. And so I think a lot of these things coalesce in a way where minorities, due to kind of the historical reality of like discrimination, become these vulnerable beings with no agents. and they're often are used as a kind of stick to kind of differentiate, particularly a kind of liberal left elites from the working class. So if you are kind of someone that speaks all of the correct language and uses all of the right words and cares about the kind of real or perceived grievances of minorities, you're kind of morally superior, and you're kind of in the know. And I think it's very sad, because then minority groups, they never get the possibility of actually transcending. They never get the possibility of actually being seen as an individual, as a human being, but just end up being a kind of buffer for kind of political elites' failure to actually genuinely reflect upon and think about what they believe in, and confront the realities of the problems in society in a meaningful way. As you know, minority issues end up being the kind of all-encompassing issues that we have to deal with. I think and so yeah, I don't know how we move away from this point. I mean, you kind of mentioned earlier the Harper's letter, and I think that that letter was very telling, because even people that are pretty much in elite levels of institutions, Harvard and world-class authors and journalists, elites essentially, were unable to stop this kind of impending cultural revolution. And so I don't know. I think it has to continue to play out. And but there's one thing that I do think that's been very revealing, because a lot of people kind of critique postmodernism, and I definitely do as well, and I understand why. But I think the rise in postmodernism has ironically been the very conditions to which we finally, as a society, start to talk about what we actually value. What is it that we conserve when we're seeing so many things be deconstructed and destroyed? Now we finally can think about, well, actually, I want this in my society. I like this about our society. Actually, I don't want us to just see each other as racialized categories. And so actually the kind of the problem that we are now all awakened to, in some senses, is now helping us to actually navigate what it is that we actually do want to take forward and conserve. And I think that conversation is going to continue to go on.
Indeed, the parochialism you refer to is fascinating to me, because I see how it's much easier for politicians, academics, people in elite positions of power, even what Adolf Reed calls the managerial class. It's very easy for them to address pronouns and proper ways of addressing a person in the various vocabulary that's been set upon us, rather than actually deal with human issues, the housing and job issues that we can see now for all of, let's say, in the American spectrum. Biden's talking about peace and the horrors of Trump's detainment of children at the border. And yesterday we saw, well, he's done a rinse and repeat of that. And he's also torn down his promises about peace in Syria. So it's very easy for us to say, excuse me, Inaya, you misgendered me, and make a whole derail on Twitter about that, rather than let's deal with the housing crisis that exists in the UK. I remember when I was living in central London, I was living the last couple of years in the waterways. I was on a narrowboat, and I can't tell you how much homelessness I saw from the narrowboat. It was incredible. Yet Corbyn and his cronies were more concerned about appeasing gender identity. How can Labour leaders in the UK square the two? And I don't think that pronouns are in the same universe or solar system as housing and poverty and meals. How did that evolve in the UK, that what's passing for left seems to be a tie-dye of the right or something? It's very bizarre to me.
Yeah, no, I think it's really, really interesting. And I've been recently reading a few Marxist critiques of cancel culture. And there's some really compelling ones, when some sections of the left are even denying that cancel culture even exists. And it's like, you know, it's so interesting how the kind of contemporary kind of popular left have essentially kind of co-opted this, or been able to argue that they are the voice of whether that's working class or young people, because there's something very striking to me about cancel culture, and that is the way in which it ironically actually takes away the voice of the young and also the poor, because of the way in which economically now so many people, particularly at the bottom of society, are in very precarious work. And so actually having a situation where you don't have job security, and your job now can no longer be got rid of by virtue of you slacking at your job, but now expressing a completely widely held and legitimate opinion, only adds the layer of precariousness that young people and people at the bottom of society experience, and therefore they end up either self-censoring or not saying anything at all, out of fear of the kind of social or economic consequences, thus actually handing more power to economic elites who can't be cancelled essentially because they have, they've got money, they've got influence, they've got contacts, they've got networks, and they'll always find a fallback. And so the people that actually get harmed the most by the kind of hypersensitivity around words and language are the very people that the left claim to actually want to be acting on behalf. And so it's a very dangerous and destructive situation where you have large swathes of the population no longer feeling as if, or even literally able to fully participate in a society. To me, that is, a challenge to democracy in and of itself. And I think part of the left, I think, is very fashionable to say that you're caring about ethnic minorities or sexual or gender minorities and things like that. And I think it's very easy. And I think a lot of people at the moment would much rather do the thing that makes them look right on, than actually do the hard and often arduous work of actually improving people's material lives. And so the fact that Jeremy Corbyn or whatever kind of mainstream political left party does when it comes to focusing on kind of minority issues to the detriment, actually, oftentimes of the majority. I think it's just a reflection of a kind of a failure of ideology, a failure of an ability to actually confront the world as it is and make sense of it as it is. And I think it's very sad because whilst that goes on, the social problems continue and actually often get worse now that we're in such a situation as this kind of global pandemic.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. From the decolonizing period of the 50s with, let's say, Nkrumah, all the way through Algeria, Morocco, you name it, countries were decolonizing one after another from, 1956 on. And what has taken its place in the last 20, 30 years has been the rise of NGOs. And I saw this on the ground in Haiti, where I was doing work on several projects, one of which was child trafficking. And I remember thinking, wait, MINUSTA, the UN in Haiti, has been here for decades. And what has it really done about this problem of child trafficking? And so then I got to reading a great book called The Lords of Poverty, which was written years ago in the early 80s, a book I had really wished to have read earlier than I had, because it deals with this way in which Western countries have taken it upon themselves to cure the poor, the starving, all these other countries that they see in need of them. And over the past year, I've thought a lot about the Lords of Poverty and the way in which, even BLM and other movements have taken that same posture towards, but they just need us to speak for them. And when I say BLM, I'm talking about, the ringleaders. I'm talking about people who are cashing in on this, who are not themselves disenfranchised or poor, not themselves in prison unjustly, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is not to say that there is no violence and no racism, et cetera, but how is it that we know that there's been this kind of sleight of hand between missionaries in various parts of the world to now NGOs replacing the missionaries to continue the mission? And we're seeing this brought home. In a way, I view a lot of the protests last year and the way that people talk about structural racism, because they can never define it. It's this way, as you said earlier, of the individual inserting him or herself into this framework of, I'm cool, I'm woke, don't touch me. And I do wonder if the people making these arguments, and they have, all backgrounds, some of them are Black, many of them are not. And these people are sort of cashing on the latest ideological currency. Is this also related to the fact of high joblessness amongst those who were schooled in wokeism and critical, race studies, in cultural studies, and there are no more jobs for them? To, I do question why this has persisted so long, because I saw that there were places for people like that in Haiti in the UN, because they were sitting in those posts. But clearly there are more people educated in woke institutions who don't know what to do with that education. When you leave an institution, even with a bachelor's degree, and you've been taught that racism is everywhere, that post-colonial struggle has to continue, you're sort of left with the record skipping a beat constantly. Like there's no end to the song. It will just constantly go over and over the same thing. And I fear that that's what's happening to us. In many countries where we want to speak for the poor and the downtrodden, the disenfranchised, we're creating the myth of the poor, etc., even though they do exist in reality. But there's a kind of usurpation of this image of these people to make jobs happen, to create more NGOs, to create more startups, and to click on to donate to this cause. And what's happening to the actual disenfranchised? You know what I mean?
No, I think you actually make a really good point. And again, it kind of touches upon what I said earlier. I think there's two really interesting aspects of kind of the identity politics, which is the way in which it is kind of used as a radical form of differentiation from like the so-called lower orders, as that's how they treat them. And so yeah, with the language and the books and all of this kind of stuff, you become a part of this kind of priestly class. And you are right to touch upon whether or not this has anything to do with the fact that a lot of young people kind of don't have jobs and are graduating in a much more precarious economic climate. So this is a way of signaling your class, your higher class, by knowing all of the latest kind of fashionable kind of ideological trends. But it also is now become a very booming industry. I mean, the kind of absolute explosion of the kind of so-called diversity and inclusion industry, with whether the consultants and all of those things, it really has bolstered, as you mentioned earlier, the kind of managerial class who now have a new way of disciplining staff. It's a very disciplinary regime, where you kind of going into people's psyche and re-educating you into correct thinking, and you can be reprimanded if you don't score high enough and on various different tests. And this is a real shift in, and the consequences are very significant. The kind of breakdown of the separation between the public and the private sphere, how your workplace is now also the domain of kind of has become politicized. And again, this is another interesting thing, the way in which the left have turned, which is kind of exported social transformation to the capitalist classes, who they're now the vanguard of social transformation and kind of ending racism and all of these kind of social ills, and it's now on, it is now encompassed on, is now responsibility of the economic elites to kind of do away with us. And I think that tells us something about the ideology, that it's essentially ideology, and it doesn't actually challenge anything. It doesn't really reach anyone in a very, very distinct and meaningful way. And whilst all of this has happened, none of the suggestions I've personally heard from the kind of left modernists is the kind of to actually improve the material life of people. It's all been a kind of is a lot of it's been a veneer, and I think it's very sad. And I think, but interestingly enough, I think a lot more people are kind of switched on to that reality, and that's one of the, I guess, to some extent, positive things, if you can call it that, from the last year, where a lot of more heterodox voices, so to speak, have emerged to kind of make sense of how the narrative that that we've been kind of fed isn't actually stacking up to reality. And we even saw that as recently as the kind of the end of last year, that the election, or whatever people's thoughts are on who should have won, what was very striking as an outsider, and this is something that happened in the UK as well the year before, was that actually Trump had gained amongst ethnic minorities. And then instantly after that, I think I saw an article, I think by Nicole Hannah-Jones, talking about multiracial whiteness. Reframing it to try and say that now Black and Asian people can be white, and that's why they voted for Trump. And so we can see that it just doesn't stack up. And so hopefully more of that kind of rude awakening. Hopefully more of that will then start to chip away at the narrative.
White is the new black. I'm saying, this is so funny. I mean, when you start to speak about the training, I just can't even think about D'Angelo's book without cackling. It's really hard not to, because it's so insane. And it's got this, the whole ideology, not just D'Angelo, not to pick on her, but that whole ideology has a mechanism built in that's exactly what the Inquisition did. It goes like this. If, like recently, parents in Brooklyn and all over New York actually were complaining, worried that their kids were being taught that they were guilty of being original sin racist because they were white. And what someone wrote, I forgot who wrote this in an article, it was like, well, this is just proof that they're really racist. So by denying, by saying that there's a problem with such a mechanism that claims that everyone who has a certain kind of hue of skin is born a de facto racist, if you disagree with that, then it's proof that you really are a witch, to use, the other analogies.
Yeah.
And it's insane, because I wrote a piece last year about the weapons industry being involved in BLM, because you have a major weapons industry that's putting on its website that we're committed to BLM. And I was just like, you have got to be kidding me. But don't ask the Yemenis what they think, right? About the bombs hitting them.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting, and about how wokeness, whatever you want to call it, provides moral cover to elites. So it doesn't matter if you're destroying the environment, or committing horrendous acts of kind of war potentially, or not even fulfilling your obligations as a kind of political representative, as long as either you come from a particular identity or espouse certain ideas, then you can be shielded from criticism. And I think I've not actually commented at all on the kind of Meghan and Harry situation, and I'm not necessarily going to get into it in details. But what I do just find interesting is how, even if somebody who is perhaps what probably the most pinnacle position you can get in a society, a hereditary monarchy of one of the most influential countries in the world, if essentially you can just talk about, you know, race or gender or climate change or something like that, then you attain a kind of level of sainthood. And I think that this is really worrying for the entrenchment of kind of deep, vast social inequality, where elite individuals can, all they have to do is espouse certain ideas to then be able to protect themselves from any criticism, and we're in a very dangerous situation then, because if we cannot criticize power, because that is what freedom of speech and you know, basic fundamental freedoms are primarily used for, to kind of, and journalism, the freedom of the press, to criticize power. And if now power cannot be criticized as long as it espouses certain ideas, or claims to have certain beliefs, then we're not living in a free society. So I'm not one of the kind of catastrophizers or alarmists, even though I think they're very justified, who kind of say we're on a precipice and this ideology kind of has the potential for civilizational collapse. Like I'm not sure about that. I'm not a fatalist. I do think there's spontaneity, I guess, in the universe, which means that just as we didn't predict the kind of emergence of BLM in the way it happened last year, you know, we may well have a kind of radical expression of hedonism after we open up as a society. So I don't know, but ultimately I agree with those who do take the problem of kind of left authoritarianism, wokeness, identity politics, whatever people call it, as something that is essentially in opposition to certain fundamental elements of our society. Because if we cannot criticize power, if they articulate certain ideas, then we don't really have a democracy in a meaningful way.
I didn't watch it.
Good.
I haven't watched it. I saw a little blip, and I just thought, we've got one of the most powerful people in media in the US interviewing one of the most powerful, as you pointed out, hereditary units of one of the most powerful families on the planet. Meghan is the lightweight in this show, but it's just perverse the way that this is presented to us. I mean, in the middle of many people's lockdown, because now I have no clue who's in lockdown where anymore, because I'm on number 3 lockdown, I think. And it's just odd that this is what Oprah Winfrey chooses to show us. And my initial rage was at neither Harry nor Meghan. It's like, Oprah, what are you doing? Like, you know, that you have people in your own country who cannot buy food. And I would have thought, you know, she had a very social human rights base. So I'm talking back when she started as a very small channel in Chicago back in the day. My mother used to watch her. She was very interesting before she got popular. And I just thought, well, where is the lefty Oprah, because she was far more left then, who can, you know, sort of exploit her power to show the madness of what's going on with late stage capitalism and lockdown. You know, people in New York City who I know who are being told they can pay back their rent now. How is anyone who's made no money for the past year going to pay back tens of thousands of US dollars in rent? And these are the discussions that no one is having, not even the quote unquote woke leftists.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, it's a very good point, because I think that's one thing that's very interesting about it, is that it creates a constant pantomime. The whole ideology, whether that is, you know, a kind of outrage over, you know, misgendering, or outrage over, you know, we recently saw this Vogue, not Vogue, Teen Vogue, Teen Vogue editor being fired, this very young woman, for things that she said when she was 17. And it's like, and a whole nother fury comes out of that. And, you know, there was something absurd, I can't remember what it was about. Oh, Dr. Zeus, was it? This and all of this kind of stuff. So it's a constant pantomime that we're kind of forced to participate in, because again, even the biggest television shows, the biggest broadcasters will kind of make it it kind of drives so many ratings. And in whilst all of this is happening, again, people's material lives are actually significantly diminishing by the reality of the kind of market, whether that's market forces or real kind of institutional forces stopping people from kind of going to work or anything like that. And so we're forced to participate in this pantomime whilst real kind of material issues do not get confronted or addressed. And it's very it's constant income for certain people who again can continue to say all of the right things and get the magazine covers. I mean, there was a woman, a transgender woman called Monroe Bergdorf, who got on the cover of Time magazine, which was astonishing to me, because most of what she said has been really, really, really shallow and just not very thought through, and it ends up benefiting a very, very, very small minority of people, and we're all kind of forced to engage in this, and so I think that how we deal with it. I don't think many of these institutions are completely lost. You know, some people do think, whether that's the New York Times or CNN or anyone else, is just completely captured ideologically. That they're kind of hopeless, and I think that may be a possibility. I don't know, but I do think that we're going to have to start making uncancelable institutions where actually the values that they are set to actually fulfill, whether that's free and open ideas, courage, bravery, kind of rigorous pursuit of truth, are at the heart again. Because to turn the steering wheel is going to be, I think, probably much harder than actually starting to create new things.
Certainly, I completely agree. I mean, your reference to the Teen Vogue editor, her name is Alexi McCammond. What struck me is the Moebius strip that was created there as well, because she was involved like last week in a call out. Recall that? She had called someone else out at Vogue. They lost their job. Then she's called out. And then this made me think, well, if everyone's calling everyone out, like you and I potentially in 50 years might be called out because we used an article, maybe the article "the" goes out of use. It's considered that it's murdered already 5,000 people. Who knows? And I mean, I'm being facetious here, but in a way, purposefully, because where do we stop the madness? Like, remember when Kevin Hart, he was deplatformed from hosting maybe the Oscars? And I just think, give it a break. I mean, I'm gay. I thought what he said was fine. People might hate that I say that, but part of the thing about humor is being able to first and foremost laugh at yourself. So when comedians make jokes about lesbians and their comfortable shoes, laugh at it. It's probably true. And again, this is not to excuse abuses that can and do happen via spoken word, but this nitpicking over everything that everyone said, I find a bit boring and humorless. And then at the same time, like Alexi McCammond might have been, hoisted by her own petard, as the saying goes. But maybe this is where we learn, instead of sacrificing the career of a 27-year-old who may perhaps, especially now, find it difficult to find a new job, given her reputation has been slammed. Maybe we need to stop using these techniques and stop, like full stop. And I don't know if people can. I've just, right now, I'm right before we spoke, I was redacting a piece of mine on this social media spiral that people get into, and I've seen people who I really like go crazy on Twitter, and I just wonder, what is it about people? Is it that humans are fundamentally narcissists and we just want people to like us and have more followers and clicks, and it doesn't matter to what end we insult people? Because I've seen people be really vicious on these platforms, or the more recent attacks on the journalist Jesse Singal. Why is it that people just can't seem to let go of these mechanisms that are very much the way of our spiral downward.
Yeah, I mean, the I think that we are still so we're not even in the adolescent stage of figuring out these mechanisms, because there are certain unique things about it that other people have touched upon. The fact that for the very first time, you can say something and a million people see it, and not only can a million people see it, a million people can attack you, but also not just attack you, they can praise you. And what that does to kind of, I don't know, the human psyche, I think is very, very um it is still yet to be founded. And very easily now someone can write a blog post and kind of share it around as true, and it could be completely baseless. And so we have these kinds of, and also just the, even as I said earlier, the erosion between the public and private spheres also manifested on social media, where when you're saying something on Twitter, well, you is that public? Is that, or is it because people follow you? Like, people don't really know if you're saying something that's the kind of public sphere, or is it kind of a quasi public sphere? And so all of these questions kind of upend many of the things that we essentially thought were settled, and kind of bring forth new questions. But in the meantime, whilst we're figuring out those questions, so many people are being burned. And I think a lot of people call young people snowflakes. But as I said to you earlier, I actually feel very sad for kind of younger generations who don't really know what to do, what to say, what are the consequences, how is that going to impact them in later life. They're not allowed to make mistakes, they're not allowed to learn from them, and it's memorialized and vilified on the internet in perpetuity. You know, how could you not essentially become a snowflake after that and just never want to say anything and always find everything offensive because you're just scared that it's going to traumatize everyone. And so yeah, these are real crappy things that are essentially now realities that we're going to have to deal with. And they're really hurting people, and there's incentive structures for journalistic institutions now to actually drive the viral story, and maybe make a correction a week later, but not really promote it, and so no one knows. And so you get the kind of information ecosystem filled with more fog, more confusion, and more narrative warfare. And finding our way out of that is going to be really, really tough. And I think that actually what we're seeing, unfortunately, now is that actually people are then retreating into separate platforms based, Twitter banning a bunch of people, whatever people's views are on that. I think it does essentially relegate a certain proportion of the population to the wilderness, looking for another place to go. And so we don't actually have any mechanism now to actually to dive a little deeper into each other, and not kind of jump on the caricature, as we were saying in the beginning. And so I think that some of the things that I've been arguing for, and I think it's going to be hard because obviously everything now is so internationalized, but it's the kind of the recreation of the physical public square, and like actually having places outside of the internet where we actually engage, not just in constructive discourse, but actually to kind of engage with one another beyond our political abstractions, because the internet cannot be the only place. Or at least, even though I say all of that, what one thing that I will add is that I also think the way the internet is used is both a product of the internet and how the incentive structures on social media, but also a product of the where we're at as a society. As I mentioned earlier, I think we have had a shift in the conception of what a human being is, to be one that is a much more fragile, weaker, and vulnerable one that's hypersensitive. And that's reflected in how we engage with one another on social media. We have had a kind of much more disconnected, fragmented, and socially atomized form of social organization. And that also is reflected in the kind of tribalism that we see on social media. And so I wouldn't want to frame social media, necessarily changes in social media, as a solution to social problems. But I think a kind of, we need to get serious, I think, both in America and Canada and in Europe, on the kinds of civic society building and solidarity building institutions and mechanisms, which can then start to really get to the root of why we cannot talk to one another, and why we're just going down this negative feedback loop.
Well, it's funny to see in the States that during the last 4 years of Trump, the left, in quote unquote left, neoliberals, had
Mm,
him to blame for everything. But
mm,
now he's not there, and we're seeing another
exactly.
story emerge. What are you seeing from this new era?
Well, I never thought that the problems were necessarily caused by Trump. I definitely think he exacerbated many of them. But he, in a lot of ways, was a reaction to the problems and the kind of um, and he became a kind of figurehead um, to a lot of people on the left and the right, both as like someone that could deal with all the problems on the kind of one hand, and someone that was a representative of all the problems on the other hand. And and so to me, Trump was always a reaction to the kind of issues that were being um, accelerating. And so when he eventually obviously left office, I never thought that the problems were going to go away. And I was really surprised that a lot of people, you know, many very intelligent and people that I respect very dearly did think that he would uh him going would somehow be the end of some of these problems. And I do understand some who think it at least gave a release insofar as we weren't 24/7 talking about the president and things he was saying and all that kind of stuff. But I never, ever thought that he was necessarily the root of them. And so now, um, now that he's gone, perhaps it might be an opportunity, I don't know, to actually really become honest about it, because you can no longer blame him. And you can really see it for what it is. And the fact that 30% of the population is essentially disenfranchised by being removed off of the internet. The fact that Joe Biden has very much part and parcel accepted the kind of neoliberal, kind of hyper socially liberal ideology, and that will likely become further institutionalized. And the fact that we may see a re-emergence of the kind of military industrial complex and the kind of American incursion into foreign overseas territories will then call into question the morality of many of these ideologies and how they provide moral cover. So Trump leaving may be an opportunity for people to see that actually he was definitely he exacerbated the problems, but he wasn't necessarily, in my personal opinion, the cause of it. And maybe we might get more honesty now.
I was thinking of the piece you sent me. Thomas Frank's Liberals Want to Blame the Right Wing Misinformation for Our Problems. That
Mm,
piece spoke to me. I think some of the promises of, let's say, what happened last year in the States, or the failed attempt to cut and paste BLM in the UK,
mm.
has revealed that culture is real, that you can't just copy and paste American racial history onto the UK and call that a success at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, I think you're so right. And again, as I said, I think that now hopefully we can actually people will start to reflect, as I said about the whole multiracial whiteness point. Well, a lot of people are going to read that and just think, that doesn't really make sense. And so I think people will have to reassess the narratives that they've been using to make sense of the world, and see that they're not actually stacking up. And yeah, the whole the conversation in Britain has definitely been shifting. Still got a lot of challenges, but a lot of people have now been rethinking the kind of importation of the Americanized experience. And an example would be we have a festival in Britain called the kind of Notting Hill Carnival, and when the famous singer Adele a few months ago wore some kind of Jamaican carnival clothes, a lot of African American kind of anti-racist activists were calling her a cultural appropriator, and um, and everyone in Britain was essentially horrified to hear that, because actually you know Britain, when the kind of West Indians came to the UK in significant numbers in the mid 20th century, one of the things that was created in order to integrate people was the Notting Hill Carnival, and it was meant to be a fusion of kind of Caribbean culture and British culture. And so white people in Britain very much participate in the kind of Caribbean festivities, and it's something that a lot of people are very positive about. And so and that was actually something that was regarded as a force of good and a force of integration and kind of cultural fusion. And so when a bunch of Americans basically accused Adele of cultural appropriating, it was a very big revelation to a lot of people that actually you can't import these things wholesale, and actually they don't fit with this historical and cultural specificities of the UK, and that's a very rich and very important history and tradition that, and any kind of cultural shift must take into account those specificities. And so yeah, I think now I don't think the dust is fully settled. I think by virtue of the lockdown, I think the lockdown in and of itself creates the conditions for pressure cookers that end up spilling out. So I think until we actually even just open up fully as a society, we're still going to see these massive flares of kind of tension and ideological warfare. Essentially, we've had one in Britain very, very recently in the last few days. And so until those kind of pressures are released again, I think we're going to continue. But that kind of fundamental ideological struggle that some people call the culture wars, it is something I think that gets to the heart of what is a society, what is the relationship between state and citizen, what does it mean to be a human, what are our obligations to one another. I actually think that the so-called culture wars is actually a very fundamental struggle, and a very fundamental philosophical and intellectual kind of discussion that's happening. And I don't think we're necessarily at that fundamental level yet. I think it's still very much at the level of you know, is this factually correct? Is that not factually correct? But actually, I think the question is much deeper, is like, you know, why, where are we going as a society, and why are we in this position, and how do we get to where we want to go? So yeah, it will continue to go on.
Could you tell our listeners about the Equiano project that you found and direct?
Yeah, so I founded the Equiano project in August last year, and it was something I wanted to do for ages, but obviously the kind of BLM protests gave it a sense of urgency, and the project essentially aims to promote and advocate and argue for a kind of form of universalism and humanism. And what I mean by that, the universalism is essentially that certain principles are kind of universal, and I do believe that, such as kind of human dignity and kind of freedom of speech and human agency. And the humanism is less a kind of, it's not a religious, anti-religious perspective. It's actually one that articulates the individual capacity of each human being to kind of transcend their own circumstance and take responsibility for their life. And its focus is on race, culture, and politics. And it's essentially an alternative vision to the narrative of parochialism, of intersectionality and sectarianism, and the narrative of that degrades human agency and sees us as fundamentally in a kind of warfare between different racialized categories. And that's kind of what we do, and it's been really amazing since we launched in August last year. You know, it's now become much bigger than what I had originally hoped, and there's been thousands of people that have reached out to us, just so thankful for an alternative perspective, an alternative vision. And we kind of go into schools, we go into community groups, we publish articles, we publish reports, we publish artwork, and book reviews. And it's my hope is for it to essentially be a hub for both heterodox and curious thinkers and open-minded people who are interested in a much more positive and unifying vision that actually is solution oriented, and that includes all people. It's not a space where it's about you as a Black person, you as a white person. You know, our individual humanity is what we bring to the table. And just quickly, it was named after a former slave and writer and abolitionist in the 18th century in the UK called Olaudah Equiano. And the reason I named it after him was because again, a lot of the time in Britain, we kind of center African American experience and don't always focus on the kind of the Black Britons that have been in the UK for hundreds of years. And he 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 emphasized, even during the time of slavery, the importance of moral virtue, and he showed extraordinary bravery and courage even in the face of profound adversity. And to me, that's a compelling story in the face of a society that has never been more, at least never been more materially wealthy. We have so many middle class and upper class people complaining about how terrible their life is. And so that's essentially what the Equiano Project does, and the mission is to create an alternative narrative.